The Galactic Council chamber floated in the dark space between stars, and it was a massive structure built by 3 powerful civilizations that ruled most of the known galaxy. For 200 years, the Varathian Empire and the Kelson Confederacy and the Threxian Dominion had controlled everything, and they treated younger species like children who knew nothing about the real world. Earth had joined this galactic community 40 years ago, and humanity had followed every rule they were given. They smiled when they wanted to argue, and they accepted tiny portions of space when they deserved more, and they watched as bigger powers told them where they could go and what they could do. Every time humans asked for more territory or more rights, the answer was always no, and every time the rejection came with a patronizing smile that made it clear the Council thought humans were too young and too weak to matter. Commander Daniel Hayes stood in front of the Council today with Captain Linda Morrison and Lieutenant Greg Palmer standing behind him. The 3 of them wore their crisp military uniforms, and their faces showed nothing but professional calm, even though inside they were burning with frustration. Above them, on raised platforms, sat the 3 council members who looked down at the humans, the same way they always did, with eyes that said humans were barely worth their time. Daniel had given this same speech 16 times before, and 16 times he had been rejected, but today felt different because something had changed in the past few months, and humanity was done playing nice. Daniel spoke clearly and formally as he requested expansion, rights to the outer reaches, and he explained that humanity had followed every protocol and submitted every required document. The Varathian representative was a tall creature made of crystal that bent light into rainbow colors, and it laughed at the human request with a sound that the translator turned into mocking words. The Varathian said humanity had asked this same question 17 times, and the answer would never change, because the outer reaches were reserved for established civilizations only. Linda stepped forward and asked a simple question about what made a civilization established, since humans had been part of the galaxy for 40 years and had contributed to defense and shared technology, and honored every treaty. The Kelson representative looked like a huge sea creature floating in a tank of glowing liquid, and it rippled with what seemed like amusement as it called humans children, playing at the adult table, and suggested they come back in a century or 2 to try again. Greg felt his jaw tighten with anger, but he kept quiet, and Daniel could feel the rage building in his chest, but he kept his face neutral. Then the Threxian representative, with its many segmented legs clicking together, mentioned that human military exercises near the Denub sector had been noticed, and the Council did not appreciate aggressive displays from junior members. Daniel replied coldly that those had been defensive drills in human space, and they became necessary because Varathian ships kept crossing into human territory without permission. The Varathian leaned forward with its crystal body flashing red with anger and said that humans did not own space because they only occupied it at the Council's sufferance. Those words hung in the air like poison, and Daniel felt something break inside him after 23 years of service and patience. He had believed that being polite and following rules would eventually earn respect, but that belief died right there in that moment. He looked at Linda and Greg, and something passed between them without words, and Linda gave a tiny nod, and Greg's mouth turned into a hard smile. Daniel turned back to the Council, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed completely, because all the politeness and careful diplomatic language was gone, and what remained was pure certainty. Daniel said they were done, and he formally withdrew humanity from the Outer Colonies Treaty and the Trade Regulation Accords, and he announced that Earth no longer recognized Council authority over human space. The 3 Council members stared in shock because no species had ever simply walked away from galactic law before. The Kelson gurgled that humans could not just withdraw from the system, and Linda said flatly that they should watch because that was exactly what was happening. The Threxian hissed that this was madness and that humanity would be isolated and sanctioned, and possibly invaded and crushed before they accomplished anything. Daniel smiled, but it was not a friendly smile, and he said the Council was welcome to try. He stepped closer to the platforms, and his voice dropped low but somehow carried through the whole chamber as he explained that humanity had not joined the galactic community because they needed the Council, but because they wanted to be good neighbors. Humans had tried diplomacy first because they thought the Council would be reasonable, but the Council had made a terrible mistake by confusing human patience with weakness and politeness with inability. Daniel said the Council had made the greatest error any predator could make by assuming that humans were prey. The Varathian demanded to know if Daniel was threatening. The council and Greg spoke up for the first time, saying this was not a threat but a warning. He explained that threats are what you make when you want something, but warnings are what you give when you are being polite one last time before you stop caring about politeness. Daniel nodded to his team and they turned to walk out, and the Kelson called after them, saying there would be consequences if they left. Daniel stopped at the door and looked back over his shoulder and said the council had been giving humanity consequences for 40 years, and now they were about to learn what consequences looked like when humans were the ones delivering them. The doors closed behind them with a hiss, and as they walked toward their shuttle, Linda let out a long breath and said that what just happened was huge. Greg asked what the plan was, and Daniel activated his communicator and spoke into it, saying that Operation Serious Business was now active and all fleets should move to standby positions. A voice responded confirming the order and saying the president was preparing to broadcast a message to the galaxy. As their shuttle left the council station and turned toward Earth, Daniel looked out at the stars and thought about how 40 years of being nice was finally over. Humanity had tried to be good guests in this galaxy, and they had tried to earn respect through patience, but the council had refused to listen. Now it was time to remind everyone that humans had not survived 10,000 years of evolution by being weak, and that peaceful did not mean harmless. Humans had a saying about speaking softly while carrying a big stick, and the council had heard plenty of soft speaking over the decades. Now they were about to meet the stick and learn what humans were really capable of when they stopped being polite and started being serious. President Catherine Wells stood in her office on Earth, but her words were not just for the people in front of her, because through quantum communication systems her speech was being sent to every human colony and station and ship across the galaxy. More importantly, the message was also being routed to every major alien government so they would all hear what humanity had to say at the same time. Catherine had been preparing for this moment for years, and now that it had finally arrived, she felt calm and focused as she began to speak. Catherine told her fellow humans that for 40 years, Earth had sought peace and partnership with the established galactic powers, and that humanity had extended friendship and shared knowledge and accepted limits on growth in the name of galactic harmony. Behind her, a holographic display activated and showed footage from the council chamber of what had happened just hours before when Daniel and his team had walked out. Catherine explained that today marked the end of one chapter in human history, not because they wanted conflict, but because they refused to continue being treated as second-class citizens in a galaxy they had as much right to as anyone else. On the Varathian, Homeworld Emperor Zaxthon watched the broadcast with growing alarm while his military advisors stood around him looking worried. One advisor said this had to be a bluff, because humanity did not have the military strength to challenge the Varathian Empire, let alone all three council powers combined. Zaxthon told them to keep watching, because he had studied humans carefully and he knew they did not bluff about matters of survival. Catherine continued her speech by saying that for the past 20 years, while humanity smiled and negotiated and accepted scraps, humanity had also been preparing and building and waiting for the day when patience would no longer serve them. The holographic display changed to show star maps, and red markers began appearing throughout human space, showing colonies and military bases. Catherine said the council believed humans had 32 colonies and 17 military installations, but that information was completely wrong. The map suddenly exploded with thousands of markers as secret colonies in asteroid fields and hidden shipyards in deep space and military bases disguised as research stations all appeared at once. On the Kelson homeworld, Chancellor Murtaugh thrashed violently in his tank, sending waves of glowing fluid splashing against the walls as he demanded to know how this was possible. His intelligence chief lowered his sensory organs in shame and explained that humans had used the council's own assumptions against them by building everything using methods so old and primitive that nobody had bothered to watch for them anymore. Catherine explained that humanity had moved resources using simple chemical rockets and built installations using manual labor and communicated through physical courier ships because those methods were so outdated that the council had stopped monitoring them decades ago. But infrastructure was just the beginning, and Catherine said the council had always believed human technology was adequate, but nothing special, because they had only ever seen what humanity chose to share. A new image appeared showing a sleek warship that looked nothing like the massive vessels the galaxy was used to seeing. Catherine introduced the ship as the UES Defiant and said it was the flagship of Earth's Fourth Fleet, and then she added that there were 23 fleets total that the Council knew nothing about. Admiral Kevin Bryant stood on the bridge of the Defiant watching the same broadcast his crew was seeing, and around him people worked at stations controlling technology the Council had never encountered. His second-in-command, Captain Nicole Sanders, reported that all ships were ready, and Kevin nodded with satisfaction after 30 years of secret preparation. Catherine continued, explaining that the Defiant was small by galactic standards with only 300 crew, but it represented a philosophy humans had learned long ago about how the size of the fight in the dog mattered more than the size of the dog in the fight. On the Threxian homeworld, Prime Overseer Clix watched with hundreds of visual sensors and processed information faster than most species could think. The Threxians were proud of their analytical abilities, but right now Clix felt genuine concern for the first time in decades. Clix's advisors confirmed that the infrastructure deployment was feasible if humans had started immediately after joining the galaxy, and that the resource requirements would have been enormous, but humans had proven capable of massive industrial efforts throughout their history. The fleet claims were harder to verify, but given the infrastructure they had revealed, the numbers could be accurate. Catherine was reaching the end of her speech, and she made it clear that humanity did not seek to conquer or dominate, but only wanted what every thinking species deserved, which was self-determination and freedom to grow and respect from neighbors. Her expression became harder as she said humanity would not beg for these things anymore, and that as of this moment, all human colonies and ships and citizens were under Earth's direct protection. Humans would expand where they chose and travel where they wished and trade with whoever they pleased, and any attempt to interfere would be met with immediate and overwhelming response. Emperor Zaxton said quietly that Catherine was not declaring rebellion, but secession from the entire galactic order. His military commander insisted they could crush humanity, because the Varathian fleet alone outnumbered known human ships 10-1. Zaxthon repeated the words known human ships and told his people to watch what happened next, because he suspected they were about to learn how little they actually knew. The display behind Catherine changed one final time, showing real-time footage from dozens of locations across the galaxy where human warships were appearing from hidden facilities and dropping stealth systems and arriving from places nobody had suspected existed. Catherine said the politeness was over and the seriousness was beginning, and the Council had 3 days to respond to Earth's terms. Humans required recognition of sovereignty over all human-occupied space and formal apologies for years of mistreatment, and new treaties between Earth and the Council as equals, not subordinates. She leaned forward and the camera focused on her eyes, showing absolute determination as she said that if these terms were not met, humanity would demonstrate exactly why peaceful should never be confused with harmless. Humans had been trying to talk, but in 3 days they would start teaching instead if necessary. The broadcast ended, and across the galaxy and throne rooms and council chambers and military headquarters, the most powerful beings in space sat in stunned silence. On the bridge of the Defiant, Kevin turned to his crew and said that for 40 years they had watched and waited and prepared and trained and built and hidden and planned, but today they would stop hiding. He settled into his command chair with a slight smile and ordered the ship to head for the Denub sector, because it was time to introduce themselves to the Varathian fleet in a nice and friendly way. Nicole raised an eyebrow and mentioned there were 47 Varathian warships in that sector, and Kevin's smile widened as he said he knew, and it seemed like a fair fight, so they should bring 2 more human ships along, because they would not want the Varathians to think humans were being rude by not bringing enough ships to make things interesting. The Denub sector had belonged to the Varathian Empire for 300 years, and 47 massive warships patrolled the area, with each one built from crystal technology that could withstand tremendous damage and fire energy beams capable of cracking planets. Fleet Commander Velthar had commanded this sector for 20 years, and not once had any enemy vessel dared to challenge Varathian authority here, so when his sensors detected 3 human ships approaching, he felt only contempt and dismissal. His tactical officer reported that 3 ships of unknown design were coming toward them, making no attempt at stealth or deception, and Velthar ordered his crew to open a communication channel so he could tell these foolish humans to leave immediately. The view screen activated, showing Admiral Kevin Bryant sitting relaxed in his command chair, looking almost bored as Velthar announced himself as fleet commander of the Varathian Empire and ordered the humans to reverse course or be destroyed. Kevin scratched his chin thoughtfully and said he appreciated the greeting, but humanity was not turning around because this was not Varathian space anymore, since Earth had claimed the Denub sector about 6 hours ago and they were here to take possession. Velthar's crystal body flashed angry red as he demanded to know if humans really thought they could claim Varathian territory with only 3 ships against 47 and said their arrogance would be their destruction. Kevin acknowledged that maybe the humans would be destroyed, but before the shooting started, he wanted to give Velthar a chance to withdraw peacefully, and he called it professional courtesy since they were all military people and there was no reason for anyone to die if it could be avoided. Velthar snarled that humans did not give orders to the Varathian Empire and commanded all his ships to charge weapons and prepare to fire on his signal. Kevin sighed and told Captain Nicole Sanders to show the Varathians what they were really dealing with, and Nicole ordered all 3 human ships to activate defensive screens and put weapons on. Stand by, because she wanted the Varathians to shoot first so they would really understand what was about to happen to them. The Varathian fleet fired in perfect coordination with 47 capital ships unleashing enough energy to vaporize a small moon, and the weapons crossed space in seconds, converging on the 3 human vessels. Then something impossible happened because the attacks just stopped in mid-air as defensive screens appeared around the human ships that looked different from any shield technology the galaxy had ever seen. The Varathian energy beams hit those screens and simply disappeared. As their power scattered into dimensions the Varathians could not detect or target. Velthar whispered that nothing could withstand that much concentrated firepower as his crystal body faded to shocked white. Kevin explained calmly that the screens did not actually block energy but redirected it into higher dimensional space, so the Varathian weapons had never actually touched the human hulls. Kevin leaned forward and asked if Velthar wanted to continue, because it was humanity's turn now and he promised the fleet commander would not enjoy what came next. Velthar ordered all ships to take evasive action and return fire at maximum intensity, but Kevin just muttered that the Varathian was being stubborn. Nicole reported that targeting solutions were already locked on all 47 enemy vessels, and Kevin told her to demonstrate rather than destroy by taking out weapons and engines while leaving life support systems intact. Nicole confirmed and gave the order to fire. Each of the 3 human ships launched a single weapon that did not look like the massive energy beams or torpedo spreads the galaxy used, but were small projectiles that accelerated to near light speed in seconds. Each projectile split into dozens of smaller pieces as it approached its target, and those pieces, guided by artificial intelligence, struck with surgical precision. On Velthar's flagship, alarms screamed as weapon systems exploded outward, sheared away by impacts that cut through crystal armor, like it was paper, and his engines died a second later, removed so precisely that nearby life support systems were not even scratched. The same thing happened to all 46 other Varathian ships, and in less than 10 seconds the entire fleet was crippled and drifting helplessly in space. Velthar could not form words as he tried to understand how his entire fleet had been destroyed without any chance to fight back, and he finally asked what kind of weapon could do this. Kevin explained almost gently that they were kinetic kill vehicles using old technology, really, because humans had been throwing rocks at each other since living in caves, but had simply gotten very good at it over thousands of years. When you could throw rocks at near light speed with perfect accuracy, you did not need fancy energy weapons or complex systems. Kevin stood from his command chair and said his medical teams were preparing to help because the Varathians had wounded people, and humans were not monsters. He emphasized that every Varathian ship was intact and repairable because humanity had chosen to disable rather than destroy, and if they had wanted to kill, there would be nothing left but debris floating in space. Velthar asked why humans would show mercy when Varathians would not have done the same, and Kevin said that was the difference between them. Humanity had not wanted this fight but had wanted peace and partnership instead. But since the Varathians insisted on testing human strength, they were learning a lesson now. The lesson was that humans were extremely good at war after practicing on each other for 10,000 years, and knowing every trick and strategy and method that violence could take. Kevin gestured around his bridge and explained that every person there had grown up on a planet where humans clawed their way to the top of the food chain by being persistence. Predators who never gave up and never quit and absolutely never accepted defeat. Kevin sat back down and told Velthar to call Emperor Zaxthon and explain exactly what happened, and recommend strongly that the Empire accept Earth's terms. Velthar asked what would happen if they refused, and Kevin's expression became cold as he explained that humanity would stop being merciful. He pointed out that Velthar was a military officer who understood logistics and had seen what 3 human ships could do, and humanity had 23 fleets with over 2,000 ships total. Those ships were not built for show, but were built because if humanity ever had to fight a war, they intended to win quickly and decisively. The Council could accept humanity as equals and keep peaceful relations, or they could fight and learn what happened when they provoked a species that invented total war. But Kevin promised that nobody wanted to see what humans looked like when they stopped being nice. The transmission ended, and Velthar sat surrounded by damaged systems and injured crew, knowing he had to make the hardest call of his career. He ordered communications to contact the Emperor and say they had encountered a situation beyond their ability to handle. When asked what happened, Velthar looked at the 3 human ships hovering nearby with medical shuttles already helping his wounded and said the humans had stopped being polite and they should all be grateful humans were still being merciful. The Council chamber had never seen a meeting like this in its 300-year history, because for the first time the 3 great powers were not sitting in judgment, but were meeting another species as equals, and they had not chosen this willingly. President Catherine Wells stood at the center of the chamber, with Admiral Kevin Bryant and Commander Daniel Hayes beside her, while holographic displays showed the current situation across the galaxy, with human fleets holding position in dozens of sectors and thousands of ships the Council never knew existed. The displays also showed battle reports from 3 days of fighting, and the numbers were shocking, not because of how many died, but because of the imbalance between sides. Over 400 Council ships had been disabled or captured, while humanity had lost 0 ships with only 12 vessels taking minor damage, and total human casualties were 37 injured, with none killed. Emperor Zaxthon's crystal body glowed with muted colors showing reluctant respect, mixed with lingering anger as he admitted that humanity had made their point clear, and that human military capabilities exceeded all projections by factors they were still trying to calculate. Catherine replied calmly that Earth was not there to gloat, but to establish a foundation for real peace, based on mutual respect rather than enforced hierarchy. Chancellor Murtak thrashed in his tank, still agitated even after 3 days to process this new reality, and he said humans spoke of peace while occupying territories the Confederacy had claimed for generations. Kevin stepped forward respectfully and explained that humanity was occupying empty space and resource-rich systems that had never been developed, because the Denub sector, for instance, had been called Varathian territory for 3 centuries, but had not a single permanent installation since it was claimed only to deny it to others. Prime Overseer Clix clicked its legs and said the principle remained, that humans had unilaterally changed the galactic order, and asked what prevented other species from doing the same, because humanity had created chaos. Daniel spoke for the first time, saying they had created opportunity instead, because for 40 years the 3 Council powers had maintained a system where they divided the galaxy and told everyone else to wait their turn. He pulled up data showing that 12 species had joined the galactic community in those 40 years, but 0 had been granted expansion rights, except the Council powers themselves. Daniel explained that humans had studied galactic history, and the pattern was clear, showing that the Council did not maintain peace through justice but maintained control through suppression, by limiting and restricting any species that showed potential. Zaxthon argued that a stable galaxy required structure, and without central authority there would be endless wars. Catherine challenged this by asking if that was really true, or just what the Council told themselves to justify keeping power, because, from humanity's perspective, the stable galaxy looked like 3 empires preventing competition rather than 3 leaders promoting cooperation. She gestured at the display showing that in 3 days humanity had engaged Council forces across dozens of systems and won every fight, but instead of pressing their advantage or seizing more territory, or destroying fleets they had disabled and captured and offered terms. Every prisoner had been returned unharmed and wounded. Enemies had received medical care, and humans had even offered help repairing damaged ships. Murtak demanded to know why humans would do this, because if their goal was domination, they had the advantage, so why stop now? Kevin answered that domination was never the goal, and humanity was not interested in ruling the galaxy, but in being part of it as equals. He activated another display showing a proposed new structure for galactic governance with a reformed council, expanded to include not just the 3 current powers, but any species meeting objective criteria for membership. Representation would be based on population and territory, and contribution to stability rather than military might alone. Clix observed that this sounded like democracy applied to galactic governance, and Daniel asked if that was a problem. The overseer replied that it was unprecedented and potentially unstable, because democratic systems required consensus, and what would happen when species disagreed fundamentally. Catherine said the same thing that happened in any working democracy, where people negotiated and compromised and found solutions that worked for everyone, not perfectly, but better than the alternative. Saxton asked quietly what would happen if the council refused this proposal, and the room fell silent as Catherine's expression became serious. She explained that humanity would do what they always did when facing unjust authority by ignoring it and expanding where they chose and trading with whoever they pleased and building alliances with other species. Tired of being treated like children, humans would create a competing power structure, and the galaxy would split into factions. Catherine said she did not want that, and believed the council did not want it either, but humanity would not return to being dismissed and limited just because it was convenient for established powers. Kevin added bluntly that in a sustained conflict, Earth would win not easily, and not without cost, but they would win because they had spent 40 years preparing for this possibility. Human technology was more advanced in key areas, and industrial capacity was vast and distributed, and the people were unified in ways that empires spanning thousands of systems could never match. But winning would mean devastating conflicts and massive casualties on all sides, and a galaxy torn apart by war. So humans were willing to fight if necessary, but would much rather build something better together. There was a long pause as the 3 council members communicated privately, weighing options and calculating outcomes. Finally, Zaxthon spoke, saying humans had presented a choice between accepting change or facing destruction, which was not really a choice at all. Catherine agreed it was not a real choice, but it was better than no choice, which was what the council had been giving other species for centuries, and at least Earth was being honest about the situation. Murtak rippled and asked what guarantees existed that humanity would not simply dominate the new council, since they had demonstrated military superiority, so why would they not use it? Daniel answered that humanity had learned something the hard way through their own history, which was that military power could take territory but could not build lasting peace because that required trust and cooperation, and institutions serving everyone's interests. He showed another document proposing that no species, including Earth, could hold more than 20% of council votes, and military spending would be transparent and capped relative to economic output. Territorial expansion would be regulated by objective criteria available to all species, and there would be a judicial system for disputes not controlled by the strongest powers. Clix processed this rapidly and observed that humans were proposing to limit themselves and place restrictions on Earth's power even while establishing it. Catherine confirmed this was true because humanity was not trying to replace the council's empires with their own, but trying to build something better than empire that actually worked for everyone. She stepped closer to the platforms, and her voice became passionate as she said they knew they were new, and their history was not as long, and territory not as vast, and culture not as ancient, but maybe that was exactly why they could see what the council had become blind to, which was that the current system was broken. It served the powerful and suppressed everyone else, and systems like that eventually collapsed, usually violently. 6 months had passed since the restructuring began, and the Galactic Assembly met for the first time in a chamber that had been expanded and redesigned. Instead of 3 elevated platforms where old powers looked down on everyone else, there was now a circular arrangement where representatives from 27 species sat as equals. Catherine Wells no longer carried the title of President of Earth, because she had been elected as the first Secretary General of the Galactic Assembly, which was a position with administrative power, but no military authority. It had been a difficult election, but even species skeptical of humanity's intentions recognized that Earth had kept every promise made during those tense 3 days of conflict. Catherine stood at the center of the assembly, looking at the diverse gathering where Varathians sat beside humans and Kelson delegates shared workspace with species previously denied council recognition. The Threxian Dominion had sent not just Prime Overseer cliques but a delegation of younger Threxians, recognizing that the future required fresh perspectives. Catherine began by saying that 6 months ago this assembly did not exist, and the galaxy had been governed by 3 powers maintaining stability through suppression rather than cooperation. But that era was over now. She activated a holographic display showing the changes that had occurred in the past months, explaining they had accomplished more than many thought possible by establishing territorial expansion protocols that allowed any species meeting objective criteria to claim and develop new systems. They had created the Galactic Development Fund, pooling resources to help younger civilizations advance technologically and economically, and formed the Joint Exploration Initiative, combining the strengths of multiple species to explore beyond current boundaries. Ambassador Marcus Cole, who was Earth's primary representative, added that these were not just bureaucratic achievements, but represented a fundamental shift in how species related to each other, because they were no longer competitors fighting over scraps but partners building something larger than any could achieve alone. Emperor Zaxthon rose with his crystal body glowing in colors that now indicated genuine warmth rather than diplomatic courtesy, and acknowledged that the transition had not been easy for the Varathian Empire, which had surrendered authority held for centuries. He gestured toward several smaller species representatives and said they had gained allies instead of subjects in innovation, from species whose ideas were previously dismissed, and most importantly they had gained peace built on consent rather than force, which was worth more than territory or authority. A Kelson delegate named Ambassador Sorthak rippled in his tank, agreeing that the Confederacy had discovered cooperation was more productive than domination, and their economy had grown faster in 6 months than in the previous 20 years simply because they were now trading with species they had previously ignored. But not everyone was satisfied, as a delegate from the Praxian Collective stood abruptly with his scales darkening with skepticism. Ambassador Threx said these were fine words, but humans had arrived with overwhelming force and demanded change while speaking of equality, even as they maintained the largest military fleet in the galaxy. So how was this different from the old council? The chamber fell silent because it was the question many had been thinking but few had voiced directly. Admiral Kevin Bryant stood to respond, saying it was a fair question that deserved a direct answer, and he pulled up fleet disposition data showing every human military vessel's location and status. Earth currently maintained 23 active fleets, but had also invited assembly inspection teams to visit any facility and review military budgets and verify compliance with the defense spending limits humans themselves had proposed. Captain Nicole Sanders stood beside the Admiral and added that Earth had offered to train integrated military units with other species, not to command them, but to share tactical knowledge and technology, because humans were not hoarding advantages but distributing them. Commander Daniel Hayes, who now served as Earth's chief diplomatic officer, continued by saying the real answer was not about fleets or technology, but about intent and accountability, because the old council had maintained power with no checks or balances or ways for smaller species to challenge decisions. This assembly had mechanisms for oversight and dispute resolution and collective decision-making, so if Earth abused its power, the assembly could sanction them or restrict expansion, or even vote to reduce their representation. Daniel looked directly at Ambassador Threx and said humans had built in the tools to keep themselves honest, which the old council had never done. Catherine stepped forward again and said she wanted to be very clear that humanity fought to be part of this galaxy, not to rule it, and they demonstrated strength, not to intimidate, but to earn the right to be heard. Now that they were here, their goal was to make themselves obsolete, which caused Emperor Zaxthon to ask curiously what she meant by that. Catherine explained that right now Earth had the strongest military, but they were sharing technology and training other species, and helping build defensive capabilities across the assembly, so in 20 years, multiple species would have military forces comparable to humanity's, and that was exactly what they wanted. She smiled slightly and said, Humans learned from their own history that peace was most stable when power was distributed, because when no single nation or species was dominant, everyone had incentive to cooperate. Earth was deliberately working to create a galaxy where they were one strong voice among many, rather than the only strong voice. Ambassador Lisa Chen, who represented Earth for scientific cooperation, added that they were applying the same principle to technology and economics because the Galactic Development Fund was not charity, but investment in creating partners rather than dependence, since every species they helped advance became a potential ally and trading partner and contributor to collective knowledge. Prime Overseer Clix clicked an approval pattern and said the Threxian Dominion had analyzed human governance patterns extensively, finding a species that repeatedly chose to limit centralized power in favor of distributed authority. While humans were capable of violence, they consistently preferred cooperation when possible, and this matched their actions since joining the assembly. Another delegate asked what happened when human interests conflicted with assembly decisions, and it was a crucial question everyone wanted answered. Catherine took a moment before responding that they would face the same challenge every functional democracy faced, which was balancing individual interests with collective good through argument and debate and voting, where sometimes they would win and sometimes lose, and when they lost they would accept it because they helped create this system and believed in it. She paused and added honestly that there were limits, because if the assembly ever decided to restrict a species' fundamental rights or prevent them from existing and growing, Earth would object strenuously, since they had not fought to be part of a new system just to watch it become the same as the old one. Ambassador Threx pressed, asking if humanity would go to war with the assembly they helped create if their objections were overruled. Kevin answered, they would cross that bridge if they came to it, but the whole point of this system was preventing situations like that from arising through built-in checks and balances and rights and protections, so no species felt they had to choose between submission and war. He met the Praxian delegate's eyes directly and said humans had a saying about trusting but verifying, so they were asking for trust while building in ways to verify it by letting everyone watch and hold them accountable, because if humanity ever betrayed the principles they fought to establish, the entire assembly would be there to help resist them. There was a long moment of silence before Ambassador Threx's scales slowly lightened to a more neutral color, and he said that was acceptable for now at least. The meeting continued for hours, working through dozens of issues from trade disputes to exploration protocols, but the crucial moment had passed as the assembly accepted that humanity, despite its power, was genuinely trying to build a cooperative system rather than a new empire.